Obviously, in this town of 100,000, there were many who didn't like what was happening. But as we looked at the soldiers, we knew there must be millions of others who thought we represented something important. When the doors closed behind us that day, it was both an end and a beginning.
When 4 African-American college students placed an order at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, they sparked acts of civil disobedience in many other cities.
During the early weeks of February 1960, the demonstrations that came to be called the sit-in movement exploded across the South. Within a period of 2 months, the movement had spread to 65 cities involving every southern state, with the exception of Mississippi. The new tactic came as a surprise, creating bewilderment and confusion in the white communities and even among the Negroes themselves.
You go to a counter. You do not request that the person sitting next to you get up and leave. You merely come in and sit down beside him, as any human being would do. You cause no violence. You have no angry words. You're friendly. And it sort of helps to project the idea that here sits beside me another human being.
Altogether, it was a moving feeling within me that I was sitting there demanding a God-given right, and my soul became satisfied that I was right in what I was doing. At the same time, with something deep down within me, moving me, that I could no longer be satisfied or go along with an evil system, that I had to be maladjusted to it. And in spite of all of this, I had to keep loving the people who denied me service, who stared at me.
On the morning of the 27th, this was to be our first real violent day. It was the first time when we could really test our own convictions as far as nonviolent means were concerned. 5 ministers said to us, if you go downtown today, you're going to be arrested. Please don't go downtown, because we're not prepared. We should have community behind us. Paul LaPrade, he was one of the few white students who were with us. They always pick on the white students because they hate to see white sympathizers. When it happened, that all of us wanted to be hit. This was an experience that we needed to keep our movement going, to keep ourselves going, and to convince ourselves that we really were nonviolent.
To test a ruling that outlawed segregation of bus stations and terminals serving interstate travelers, biracial groups of men and women volunteered to take bus rides through the South using the wrong facilities at stops. Several freedom riders were injured because of mob violence instigated by segregationists, eliciting an outpouring of support and concern.
What these people are doing is not just traveling through Alabama in interstate commerce or interstate travel. They're buying tickets from town to town and getting off in each town and seeking through mixed groups, Negro men and white women, to force themselves into situations which tend to inflame the local people and incense them.
We were antagonized by some of the hoodlums who were on the bus. As we got off the bus, Jim Peck and I, we decided to proceed with our plans.
Which were what?
To enter the lunchroom and the waiting room. So we proceeded down this ramp, and we were met by stares and cat calls. And as we entered the waiting room, the men who were aligned around the wall came toward us. They huddled us in a small corner by a pinball machine. Then they took me and forced me out of the door and threw me into the crowd, and there I was beaten by one big guy and several others. Then I was thrown forward, and I was hit on the back of the head with something.
At that point, they started breaking the windows of the bus with chains and pipes and one thing and another. They finally threw a bomb into the bus.
I'm tired of segregation, and now I want my equal rights. Well, respect and education, well, not social integration. That's why I'm fighting for my rights. I'm fighting for my rights. Yes, I'm fighting for my rights.
We're going to keep coming until we can ride from anywhere in the South, any place else in the South, without anybody making any comments, just as American citizens.
More than 250,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. for racial justice in 1963, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Just 100 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, 200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come by train, they come by bus and by air. They come from the north, the south, the east and west. They come united in one cause, to urge Congress to pass a civil rights bill to end forever the blight of racial inequity. This great throng with a cause gathers on the mall that stretches from the Washington Monument toward the Capitol. From the break of dawn, they filter into the city. By 9:30, it is estimated that 40,000 had assembled. But it's more like a Sunday outing as they form into groups and discuss the day quietly. They are scheduled to move to the Lincoln Memorial at noon to hear the top leaders of the movement. Those leaders, at the moment, are conferring on Capitol Hill with members of Congress, pointing up the aims of the rally. By 11:30, there are more than 200,000 thronging the mall, a crowd that is bigger than the most optimistic forecasts. Now there's a growing animation. It seems as if the demonstrators were finding strength in each other, had discovered their cause was a bond. The crowd became impatient to get started, and they moved toward the Lincoln Memorial before the scheduled hour. They move with good humor, laughter, and song. Few realize that in a sense they are participants in an historical day. It will become part of the American scene that today's gathering is the largest in Washington's history. The men who organized the rally walk with springing steps toward the speaker's stand. On the left, Roy Wilkins with A. Philip Randolph. They have fought their fight all of their adult lives. In the van is Martin Luther King, who has been jailed 12 times on racial issues. Others on hand include Walter Reuther, head of the auto workers. Authorities were fearful of disorders, and there were 5,000 uniformed men on duty. They had little to do but keep dissident groups away from the rally.
To be
The crowd assembled around the reflecting pool before the Lincoln Memorial occupies every inch on the lawns and under the trees. And there's a great swell of cheers to welcome Martin Luther King to the speaker's podium, a man who stands as a symbol of all they are fighting for. Later, Mr. King and the other leaders are to go to the White House, where the president said that everyone must be impressed with the demonstration of the throng's faith and confidence in our democratic form of government. However, he warned, there's a long fight ahead in Congress. The theme, the keynote, the thought uppermost in minds of all here today is best set forth by Dr. King. He sums up a day the Capitol will long remember.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Designed to provide broad protections against discrimination on the basis of race, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Among its other provisions, the law prohibited discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels, restaurants, and theaters.
Gentlemen, we are facing one of the most critical times in the history of our nation. Minority groups in our country have taken to the streets to agitate, to demonstrate, to breach the peace, and to provoke violence calculated to blackmail this Congress into passing legislation in direct violation of the United States Constitution. You have been forced to consider this legislation through the pressure and blackmail of mobs in the streets. The President of the United States and the Attorney General have encouraged demonstrations.
We have to do something about it. We have to deal with it. We've had 100 years since the Civil War, and still the problem is not solved, and people are tired of waiting. Whites are tired of waiting, many of our white people, and Negroes are tired of waiting.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.